The Atari 2600 Plus is a brand new console which replicates the original, legendary Atari 2600 system and brings it into the modern age while keeping everything that made it so special perfectly intact. It costs $130, and at first glance it appears similar to other mini consoles produced by companies like Nintendo, Sony and Sega, but there's a few differences with the Atari 2600 Plus which make it stand apart from the competition and warrant that slightly higher price point. So join me as we plug this sucker in, see what makes it so unique, and also take a look at some of its flaws. First of all, a big thanks goes out to Atari and Plyon for sending us the Atari 2600 Plus for review. We actually got this quite far ahead of its official release on the 17th of November, so we really appreciate the opportunity to give this an early look. You'll be able to get the Atari 2600 Plus from basically any gaming retailers, or even get it online from places like Amazon. And you know what else you can get in retail stores and Amazon? That's right, our book, A Handheld History. I know I keep talking about it, but we've put in a lot of hard work to make this a reality. It's extremely high quality, there's loads of illustrations and photos along with detailed information and personal stories about handheld gaming, so definitely check it out, a link will be in the description. Clearly, the release date of the Atari 2600 Plus implies that they're targeting retro enthusiasts looking to get their fix over the Christmas period. But after the season's over, will you actually still be using this, or is it just another fancy display piece? Well, the way I see it is that there's two main audiences for this. First off are the people who have never played an actual Atari 2600 before but are interested in experiencing that generation of gaming in more depth, or potentially for the first time ever. This first target audience would be myself, and I was actually really interested in this as soon as I saw it revealed. But the second main audience are the people who played and loved the Atari 2600 and want a slightly more convenient way of revisiting the favourite games. Now, normally in this situation, the argument would be that somebody wanting to play the Atari 2600 authentically would be better off playing on the original hardware. Normally this is a good point, but where the Atari 2600 Plus separates itself from what's being offered by other mini console manufacturers is that this actually plays games with real Atari 2600 cartridges. That's right, there's no preloaded games on this thing at all. To my surprise, there's not even any kind of menu interface or anything. It works exactly like the original console, and to be honest, that's kind of awesome. This isn't just one of those novelty consoles with 10 or so games preloaded onto it and that's what you're stuck with forever. This is basically a fully functional modern replacement for your actual Atari 2600. Not only does the 2600 Plus look incredible, being almost identical to the original console, aside from being 80% of the size to make it a bit more practical, but it also uses the original controller inputs, meaning that you can plug an old Atari controller into this and it'll work perfectly. Or if you really wanted to, you could use one of these new controllers on the original Atari 2600. You may be aware that the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis controller was actually compatible with the Atari 2600 due to it sharing the exact same input. However, it doesn't appear that the 2600 Plus shares this compatibility. I went out and got a Mega Drive controller specifically to test this and found that it was sort of picking up my inputs, but it wasn't registering them properly. In games like Combat, I was able to rotate in a circle and constantly shoot by holding B and pressing a direction, but I couldn't do anything else. So either I just got a dud controller, or the 2600 Plus wasn't designed with Mega Drive controller compatibility in mind. Whether this is something that could potentially be added via a firmware update by plugging the 2600 Plus into a PC, I'm not sure. But this is something to bear in mind if you wanted to use any controllers from a different system. But let's dig a little bit deeper. Besides being a little bit smaller than the original console, what's actually new with the Atari 2600 Plus? I'll be completely honest, there's not actually a whole lot that is new, and I think that's actually what I like about this. The main things are that it uses a HDMI video output, which makes it easier to get a good looking image on a modern TV, and that it's powered by a USB-C to standard USB cable. It doesn't come with a power adapter, which is a bit unfortunate, but this isn't a problem specific to this device. Hardly anything seems to come with power adapters anymore, so you'll need to already have one of these lying around or power it from another device like a TV, providing it outputs enough power. The console comes with a single Atari 2600 cartridge which features 10 classic games to try out. There's a mixture of some top tier classics and some slightly less popular ones, but that's great because it means you'll probably get to play something you've never actually tried before. That is, unless you're an Atari veteran and you've played everything the console's got to offer. But this also means that there's quite a lot of variety in terms of gameplay here too. Something I personally really like about this is how sort of analog playing stuff on this feels. No doubt they could have made it so that putting in this cartridge brings up a menu where you can pick the game you want to play via an on-screen interface. But doing that wouldn't have reflected the actual Atari experience, damn it. So no, instead of that, you actually need to flick the dip switches on the back of the cartridge in a specific pattern to choose which game to play, and then pop it into the slot to actually begin. It's such a cool detail, which almost replicates the feeling of picking a game off of a shelf. Adding to this sort of analog nature of the console is the fact that all of the switches on the front of the device function exactly as they would on the original hardware. This means that in order to select the game mode you want to play and actually start the game at all, you'll need to have easy access to the console. In this day and age, this would probably be seen as extremely cumbersome and quite unintuitive, considering that they could have added some buttons to the controller to do this, instead of forcing you to constantly get up, walk over to the console, and then sit back down to actually start playing. But call me crazy, I actually really like all of this. I love that they've gone so far to make this feel as close to the original console as possible. It's not just the games that this thing is replicating, but the entire experience around those games too. Sure, it's ridiculous and they could have made this much more streamlined and user-friendly, but that's not what this is about. There are a couple of areas where I think they very slightly messed up here though. First of all, I really think that they should have made the controller wires a lot longer. I don't know if this is yet another way that they mimicked the original console, but the wires are a bit too short for today's room layouts. We're not sat on the floor in front of our CRTs anymore, we're on the sofa a good 6 or 7 foot away from the TV. I also think it's a little bit ridiculous that it only comes with one standard joystick controller too, with a second one costing $25. The vast majority of the games on the 10-in-1 cartridge are multiplayer focused, and combat is literally only playable with 2 people. This seems like a pretty major oversight honestly, but I guess at least it is compatible with old Atari controllers, I suppose. But that's enough complaining for now, let's move on to talk about what it's like to actually play something on this. The 2600 Plus actually uses software emulation to play the games from your cartridges. This could be a little bit off-putting, but the quality of emulation on offer here was astoundingly good. You might be worried that certain games won't work because of this too, but judging from Atari's official compatibility list, there's only 3 games which they tested which didn't work, and these are Real Sports Boxing, Super Cobra, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Quite a few of the games on this list are untested, so maybe there's a few more that don't work on top of those, but it seems like the vast majority of the library is gonna function perfectly. I actually got an original cartridge just to make absolutely sure it works properly, and of course, you know I had to go for the infamous terrible port of Pac-Man. As you can see, it worked perfectly, just like it would with the original console, which is just incredible. I suppose the downside to this is that I'm now keeping my eye out for Atari games, whereas before I wasn't really doing that because I didn't have a way of playing them. So it's a good way of revisiting and playing those old cartridges, but it's bad for your bank balance. So let's now talk about how the 2600 Plus actually works. First of all, you obviously pop a game in and turn the console on, but then you'll want to use the game select switch on the front of the console to select what game mode you want to play in. For context, a lot of Atari 2600 games had loads of different modes which changed the rules of the game slightly to make it more difficult or add in new mechanics. Sometimes this is something like swapping between single player or multiplayer options, but sometimes it literally transforms the game quite significantly, so be sure to fiddle around with that. This brings me on to another pretty annoying thing though, which is that these games don't come with replica instruction manuals to explain what all of these different modes are, or explain what the game is actually about. Games like Haunted House actually feature storylines that explain what you're actually doing in the game, but without that, you've got absolutely no context as to what's going on, and it could make certain games even more confusing than they already are. You can obviously find all of these instruction manuals online, but it's not the same as having something physical in front of you, and given Atari's commitment to authenticity with the console itself, they could have hit an absolute home run in this area if they had done this. Once you've selected the mode you want to play though, you've got a couple of other customization options to look at. First of all, do you want to play in a 4:3 aspect ratio or 16:9? For this, I would personally always go for 4:3 just because this was the original aspect ratio for these games and it looks a little bit stretched in 16:9. But because the graphics are quite primitive and mostly consist of solid blocks, it doesn't actually look too bad if you do prefer filling the entire screen. Second of all, you have the option to handicap either yourself or your opponent. There's a switch for each player on the back of the console which changes you from game type A to B, with B normally being a harder setting. Then finally, there's the switch on the front of the console which lets you pick if you want to play on a colour TV or a black and white TV. This is obviously a bit of a gimmick nowadays because I doubt you're hooking this up to an actual black and white TV, but if you want that truly retro aesthetic, you could apply the black and white filter. After all of that, you can finally press the game reset switch down and it'll begin with all of your chosen settings. Awesome. I'm not going to go into too much detail about all of the games featured on the 10-in-1 cartridge, simply because if I was to do a detailed breakdown of every single one of those games, we'd be here all day. My favourite games I played on this though were probably Yar's Revenge and Missile Command, although I do see the appeal of stuff like Adventure and Haunted House that probably just take a little bit longer to get into. On top of buying the Atari 2600 Plus console, you can even buy several optional extras to enhance your experience. The most major addition is the paddle controller bundle, which comes with 2 paddle controllers and a 4-in-1 cartridge, giving you a selection of paddle compatible games to play. All 4 of these games are pretty great too, with you getting one of the most iconic Atari games, Breakout. But you also get Canyon Bomber, Night Driver, and Video Olympics. I was actually lamenting the lack of Pong before I realised that Pong never actually released on the Atari 2600. It was called Video Olympics and offers not just a standard version of Pong, but absolutely loads of additional modes to mix up the gameplay. All of these games feel incredible with the paddle controller, by the way. It's extremely responsive and smooth. I literally couldn't imagine playing any of these without it. Night Driver is a bit weird though. It feels quite ambitious for the 2600, being this pseudo 3D driving game where you need to use the paddle as a steering wheel to avoid incoming traffic and stay on the road. I was pretty terrible at it, but hey, with enough practice, I might get better. Atari are even further supporting the 2600 Plus with enhanced versions of classic games like we see here with Berserk. This did release on the original 2600, but here it's been reprinted and basically been updated, with new sound effects, the ability to shoot diagonally, and several bug fixes. Not only that, but Atari are releasing their first official 2600 game since 1990 with Mr. Run and Jump. This is probably a bit bad to say, and Atari purists are probably gonna hate me, but this was by far my favourite game I played on the 2600 Plus. It's a 2D platformer that features some extremely challenging level design, and I think the storyline involves you rescuing your pet dog. Amazing stuff. Seriously though, the fact that Atari are making these new cartridges filled with old games, updating specific titles, and even making new 2600 games, which by the way will also work on original hardware, is just insane. Sure, Nintendo and Sony are putting old games on their online stores and subscription services, but Atari are out here making fully functional consoles that are completely compatible with original hardware, making the games more accessible while keeping everything as authentic as possible. I love it. Something I've not even mentioned yet is that the 2600 Plus is also compatible with Atari 7800 cartridges too, so if you've got any of those games in your collection, it's even more worth it. The Atari 2600 Plus isn't just a novelty, it's an amazing modern recreation of their breakthrough console, which adds in just enough quality of life features to bring the experience into the modern day, but without taking away what originally made the 2600 special in the first place. I honestly think this is pretty amazing, and I hope to see it supported by Atari even more in the future. But that wraps up my thoughts on the Atari 2600 Plus. I've actually been considering getting an original Atari 2600 for quite a while now, but now that I've got the 2600 Plus, I don't really feel the need to do that. Sure, you could go down the route of modding an original console in order to play the games completely authentically without any kind of emulation, but if you're more just wanting to experience those old games in a more casual way, then this is probably the best way to do that. But what do you think to the 2600 Plus? Are you interested in getting one for yourself? Do you think that other console manufacturers like Sega, Sony and Nintendo should be doing something similar to this? And what are some 2600 games you think I should be checking out? Let me know. As always though, give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe to see more retro goodness coming soon, remember to check out A Handheld History which is now available on Amazon, and I've been Rob from Retro Dodo, and I'll see you in the next one.